The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above the fourth floor of St. Michael's, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. 2:47 a.m. The kind of hour when the hospital stopped pretending to be a place of healing and became what it actually was, a warehouse for the dying, the broken, the ones insurance companies had already written off. Natalie Hayes moved through the medication cart with the precision of someone disarming a bomb. Each vial organized by floor, by room, by dosage, not because the hospital required it, but because she did. Her hands, marked with old rope-burn scars across the palms, worked with economical efficiency. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The cart's wheels clicked softly as she pushed it down the corridor, and she positioned herself at the perfect angle, sightline to the elevator, the stairwell, both ends of the hallway. Muscle memory from a life that was supposed to be erased. At 43, Natalie had learned to be invisible. Grey threading through her brown hair, pulled tight in a bun that pulled her face back to its essentials. Faded scrubs the color of old sky. A scar bisecting her left eyebrow, thin, precise, the kind that came from shrapnel or a ricochet, depending on who was asking. She wore a name tag that said Natalie Hayes, RN, and nothing else. No credentials listed. No mention of the 12 years before the nursing degree, before the Pentagon directive that made her a ghost. Her jacket hung on the hook at the nurse's station, navy blue, worn thin at the elbows. Her fingers touched the inside lining as she passed it, feeling the rigid outline sewn beneath the fabric. A faded unit patch. Delta Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The stitching was coming loose on one corner, and she could feel the thread fraying under her touch. She never repaired it. The damage was part of the story she wasn't supposed to have. On her desk sat a coffee mug her son had made in 3rd grade. The glaze was cracked in a spiderweb pattern across the handle, and someone had knocked it over twice in the past year, but she kept refilling it. Tyler had painted his name in blue letters, for MOM, and written I love you in red letters that bled slightly into the blue. He was 16 now. He had no idea that his mother had once carried wounded Marines out of a sandstorm in Kandahar, that she had held pressure on a thigh wound while insurgent fire shredded the building around her, that she had been Captain Natalie Hayes before she was a nurse. The elevator dinged at 2:53 a.m. Dr. Richard Mercer stepped out onto the 4th floor like he owned it. 52 years old, 220 pounds of entitlement wrapped in a white coat that had cost more than Natalie's entire month's rent. His watch was an Omega Seamaster, $12,000, she recognized it from the waiting room magazine she never read, and his tan was the kind that came from golf courses, not sunlight. He had the face of someone who had never heard the word no and never intended to. He scanned the floor with the expression of a man assessing property. His eyes moved past Natalie the way a spotlight moves past a wall. She was part of the infrastructure. Part of the facility that he operated within, not as a person, but as a function. She nodded at him, deferential, automatic, the nod of someone acknowledging rank without acknowledgement of self, and he nodded back, already moving toward the medication cart to review her charting. This was the thing about being invisible, you saw everything. Natalie had watched Dr. Mercer for 18 months. Watched how he ordered procedures that didn't need ordering, how he billed for interventions that never happened, how his phantom procedures and inflated codes had added up to something north of $847,000. She had noticed because she noticed everything. Because attention to detail had kept her alive in Kandahar, and attention to detail kept her invisible in Savannah. Her charting was meticulous. Time-stamped to the minute. Medication name, dosage, route, time of administration, patient response. Every single entry was a small testimony to what had actually happened on the unit, which meant every single entry was a liability for Dr. Mercer. Her charts created an audit trail that no insurance company could ignore. They were precise. They were irrefutable. They were going to burn his entire scheme to the ground if anyone bothered to look. She watched him scan her notes from the evening shift. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He flipped backward through the pages, his movements becoming sharper, quicker. The scar on her eyebrow didn't move. Her face remained neutral, the way she'd learned to keep it when sergeants screamed orders during live-fire drills, when mortars landed 300 meters away, when her unit took fire and she was supposed to keep moving forward as if her body wasn't screaming at her to take cover. "Your note on the morphine administration is excessive," he said without looking up from the chart. His voice was the kind that expected agreement, the kind that had never encountered real resistance. "The medication was administered at 1937, Natalie said. Her voice was quiet. Respectful. The voice of someone who understood hierarchy. The patient's pain response was documented 3 minutes post-administration. The subsequent vital signs were recorded at 2000. He closed the chart slowly. His eyes met hers, and for a moment something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, that she was not a unit secretary or a per diem nurse who would forget her notes by morning. She was someone who kept records. Someone who remembered. "More detail doesn't equal better care," he said. "No, sir," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned away. She watched him move down the hallway toward room 407, where the monitors were showing irregular patterns and the oxygen saturation numbers were drifting downward. A patient had been admitted an hour ago, critical presentation, declining trajectory. The admitting resident had labeled him "expect to lose this one," and the intern had nodded solemnly, already writing the death note in her head. But that wasn't what made Natalie's hand still on the medication cart. She had recognized him the moment she saw his face on the admission paperwork. Colonel Marcus Webb. She knew that name like she knew her own heartbeat. He had been her commanding officer in Kandahar 12 years ago, when she was someone else entirely. When she still believed that her sacrifice meant something, that the Pentagon would honor the oath of silence they'd sworn her to. He had written letters home to families. She remembered him sitting in the command tent, composing words to parents and spouses, telling them that their people were brave, that their people mattered. 3 weeks before the operation went wrong, he had sent a letter to the parents of Private Tyler Chen, her son's best friend from high school. Tyler Chen had wanted to enlist, wanted to follow the Marines, and his parents, her friends, her neighbors, had nearly destroyed themselves with worry until Mercer's letter arrived. "Your son is exactly where he needs to be," the letter had said. "In the hands of people who will not let him down." And then Kandahar happened. And then everything was erased. Natalie's hands resumed their work on the medication cart, but something had shifted. Some small balance point that had kept her stable for 12 years had tilted. She pushed the cart forward toward the next room, and her movements were still precise, still economical, still invisible. But inside, where no one could see, the buried part of her, the part that had been Captain Natalie Hayes, was waking up. What she didn't know, as she moved through the pre-dawn darkness of St. Michael's 4th floor, was that Colonel Webb's arrival had triggered something else entirely. Dr. Mercer had already begun his calculations. He was mentally reviewing everything she had documented, everything she had seen, everything she could potentially expose. Her meticulous charting had just transformed from a minor annoyance into an existential threat. He had made 3 phone calls before this morning was over. But that wasn't the worst part. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else, the sharp copper undertone of a man bleeding slowly into his own lungs. Colonel Marcus Webb lay in room 407 with an oxygen cannula looped beneath his nose, his silver star ring catching the pale morning light, his wife Margaret clutching his hand while their daughter Sarah stood at the window pretending not to watch him die. It was 0600 when Natalie entered with the morphine syringe already drawn, her movements the kind of efficient that came from 3 years of night shifts, in, medicate, chart, out. No theatrics. No sentiment. Just work. Dr. Mercer followed her in like a predator who'd caught a scent he didn't like. He checked the chart, his eye scanning downward with the theatrical slowness of a man rehearsing a performance he'd already planned. Natalie finished adjusting before line. She didn't acknowledge his presence yet. That was the mistake he was waiting for, not the medication, not the timing, but the moment she wouldn't turn fast enough to defend herself. His voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "Nurse Hayes, this medication was due at 05 for 5. Do you have an explanation for your incompetence, or should I assume you were on another unauthorized break? Margaret Webb's hand tightened on her husband's wrist. Sarah turned from the window. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, beep, 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 the only sound that didn't carry judgment. Natalie's face went utterly still. Not shocked. Not hurt. Just still, like a sniper holding her breath before the trigger pull. Her eyes moved to his with a kind of cold that doesn't register as anger because anger requires caring, and what she showed him was something far worse, complete absence of regard. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked back at the .4 bag, her hand steady as a surgical laser. The medication was administered at 0543, Doctor. 2 minutes early. Your inability to read a timestamp suggests either incompetence or deliberate dishonesty. I'm not sure which is worse for your patients. Her voice came out level and quiet, not meek, not defensive, but the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this. She turned and walked out without waiting for his response, leaving him standing in front of a dying man and his family, his mouth open like a door that wouldn't close. Margaret looked at her husband. Colonel Webb's lips twitched upward in something that might have been a smile. The break room at 0730 smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of fluorescent lit air that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Natalie sat at her usual table with a sandwich her ex-husband had made her promise to eat, turkey, Swiss, mustard on whole grain, the kind of lunch that didn't require heating or explanation. She'd arranged herself at the far end of the 8-seat table, leaving space on either side like she always did. Professional distance. No assumptions. Denise walked in first. Their eyes met for exactly 1/2 second. Then Denise turned, collected her coffee from the counter, and relocated to the corner near the vending machines where the morning shift nurses were grouping. Then Carlos, his shoulders hunched like he was ashamed of something. Then Joanne, who was wearing the uniform of someone following orders, not meeting Natalie's eyes, not speaking, just moving. Within 30 seconds, all 6 of them had relocated. The table where Natalie sat had emptied like she was contagious. She opened her sandwich, took a bite, and ate with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything else. No reaction. No tears. No wounded expression. Just jaw moving, chewing, swallowing, breathing. Her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the break room wall, maybe Kandahar, maybe just nowhere at all. That was the thing about having served in a combat hospital, you learned how to swallow pain the same way you swallowed food. From 15 feet away, by the vending machine, Denise was whispering to Carlos. Mercer said she's under investigation. Something about falsifying credentials. He said not to engage with her until it's resolved. Natalie didn't look up. Didn't react. Just continued chewing her sandwich with the methodical focus of someone completing a task. But her hands knew the truth. Her hands remembered what investigation felt like, the Pentagon directive, the scrubbed records, the phone call at 0300 in the morning that told her to vanish. This was different. This was Mercer playing with toys he didn't understand. She finished eating in silence, cleaned her area, rinsed her container, and walked back to her patients. Not once did her face betray anything. Not once did anyone see the thing beneath the surface that was watching, calculating, understanding exactly what was happening and why. At 1400, the formal corrective action notice appeared on the unit central bulletin board, the same board where the monthly schedule was posted, where holiday sign-up sheets went, where everyone gathered twice a shift. Dr. Mercer had posted it himself, using red ink and a red thumbtack like a man painting a target on someone's chest. The heading read, Corrective Action, Natalie Hayes RN, in letters large enough to be read from the nurse's station. The infractions were fabricated. Every single one. Repeated medication errors, there were none. Insubordination to attending physicians, she'd corrected a timestamp. Failure to maintain professional standards, her charting was meticulous to the point of obsession. He'd signed it with a flourish, Dr. David Mercer, Unit Director, the kind of signature that belonged to someone who believed his own authority had transformed lies into truth. Natalie stopped in front of the board at 1423. She'd been walking past it all day, patients, charting, medications, vitals, and she'd finally taken the time to read it completely. Her face showed nothing. No shame. No indignation. No fight. Just a woman reading words on a board, the way someone reads a menu they've already decided against. Dr. Mercer watched from his position near the doctor's station, arms crossed, waiting for the moment when her composure would crack. Waiting for the tears or the anger or the desperate explanation. Waiting for something human. Instead, Natalie turned directly toward him. 15 feet of linoleum separated them. Their eyes met. "Your father would be ashamed of the coward you've become." She said it the way she might comment on the weather. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just a statement of observable fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has studied the anatomy of men and understood exactly where the knife goes. Then she turned and walked toward the supply closet, leaving him standing against the wall with his hands trembling so hard he couldn't hold the coffee cup he'd been pretending to drink. The supply closet door closed with a soft click. She didn't slam it. Didn't prove anything. Just closed it the way you'd close any door in a hospital where people were dying and medication schedules mattered more than pride. That wasn't the worst part. In his office at St. Michael's, Dr. Mercer sat with his door locked and his jaw clenched so tight his molars ached. He'd spent 18 months cultivating a system so elegant it almost felt legal, phantom procedures coded with just enough plausibility, billing codes stacked like a house of cards, kickbacks from a medical supply company processed through a shell account that had its own shell account. The numbers were beautiful. The auditor hadn't noticed. The compliance officer hadn't looked twice. Then Natalie Hayes showed up 3 years ago and started charting like she was building a case. Every medication, every time, cross-referenced and time-stamped. Every procedure documented with the kind of precision that suggested someone knew exactly what she was doing. Someone who understood that paper trails were how institutions fell. He pulled up her personnel file on his computer. Natalie Hayes, RN, BSN from Savannah State, 3 years at St. Michael's, night shift, no disciplinary history until he created one. The background check was clean. The credential verification was solid. She was invisible and perfect, which meant she was dangerous. He made the first call to David Sterling, his golf partner and hospital board chairman, his voice measured and concerned, "Just keeping you in the loop. We may have a credentialing issue on my unit. Nothing confirmed yet, but I've asked HR to look into it." The second call went to Marcus Webb. "No, not that one, wrong name, wrong man." The second call went to his private investigator on retainer, a man named Garrett who made his living turning over rocks and reporting what crawled out. "I need a complete background on one of my nurses. Natalie Hayes. Start with her previous employment history. I want to know why there are gaps. I want to know what she's hiding." The third call was the boldest. He dialed the state nursing board directly and asked to speak with the credential verification department. His voice was the voice of a concerned physician. "I'm doing a routine credentialing review and I have a question about one of my staff nurses. Natalie Hayes. Her employment history shows a gap between 2012 and 2017. I don't see her listed on any hospital rosters or clinic records during that time. I was wondering if there's been any disciplinary action filed against her license that might explain the absence." The woman on the other end of the line said she'd look into it. She was very professional. Very thorough. Very unlikely to find anything, because there was nothing to find, because Natalie Hayes' military service had been scrubbed from the civilian record in a way that only a Pentagon directive could accomplish. But he didn't know that. He only knew that she was a threat and that threats needed to be eliminated. His hands had stopped trembling by the time he hung up the phone. His face had returned to normal, the face of a man who believed his own story, who had constructed a narrative in which he was the victim and she was the infection that needed to be purged. The rain started at 1800, drumming against the hospital windows like applause that would never stop. Natalie had 7 more hours on her shift, and every minute of those hours was a test she'd already passed so many times it had stopped being a test and become just another kind of breathing. Room for 07 monitor beeped. Room for 10 needed pain medication. Room for 13 needed someone to hold his hand while the morphine did its work. She moved through the unit like water through a sieve, always flowing, never pooling, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a mark. At 2200, Tyler called. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. You okay?" She stood in a supply closet, surrounded by gauze and catheters, listening to her son's voice through a phone that suddenly felt very far away. "I'm fine, honey. How was school?" "Fine. Coach Williams asked again about you coming for Veterans Day." Her eyes closed. "We've talked about this." "I know. You can't." "But Mom, don't you think it's time? I mean, I get that your service was classified or whatever, but you're not in the military anymore. You're a nurse. You could just—" "Tyler." I made promises." A pause on the other end. The sound of him breathing, thinking, understanding that there were things about his mother he would never know and that she loved him anyway. "Okay," he said finally. "Love you. Love you too. I'll be home at 0700. She hung up the phone and stayed in the supply closet for one more minute, surrounded by the instruments of healing, thinking about the promises that had erased her from the world, the Pentagon directive that had made her a ghost, the careful construction of normalcy that was now collapsing because a man named Mercer was afraid of her precision. The worst part was that she'd warned them. 3 years ago, when she'd been hired, when they'd processed her credentials, when they'd accepted her background check and moved forward without questions, she'd wondered if this day would come. When someone would look too closely at the woman who'd disappeared for 5 years and then reappeared as just another nurse in just another hospital. What she hadn't anticipated was that the threat wouldn't come from the Pentagon or the government or the classified past that had tried to erase her. It would come from a man in a tie who was afraid that her meticulous charting would expose his fraud. The irony wasn't lost on her. She picked up a box of gauze, restocked her cart, and walked back out into the unit where people were dying and medication schedules mattered and the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. The storm clouds had been gathering since noon, pressing down over Savannah like a hand on a drowning man's chest. By Tuesday evening, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, purple and black and angry. In room 407, Colonel Marcus Webb's breathing had shifted. Not dramatically. Not yet. But Natalie heard it the moment she entered, the subtle rasp of air struggling through fluid, the oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor creeping downward like a tide going out. 89%. 87. 85. She checked the chest tube she'd placed 2 days earlier, the one that should have been draining the pleural effusion filling his lungs. The collection chamber sat silent. No golden fluid had accumulated since the morning shift. She pressed the tube gently, felt for the hiss of air that should have indicated pressure release. Nothing. The tube had either kinked or dislodged. She'd seen it before, back in Kandahar when a Marine with a sucking chest wound had rolled in the back of a Humvee and the battlefield bandage had slipped during transport. She reached for the call button. "Get me the on-call resident. Now." Dr. Amy Chen arrived 4 minutes later, moving with the careful precision of someone running on empty. 28 years old, second year of residency, already carrying the hollow-eyed exhaustion that came from 16-hour shifts and impossible patience. She examined Webb's chest while Natalie pointed out the lack of drainage, the falling saturations, the way his breathing had become shallow and asymmetrical. "Chest X-ray," Chen ordered, her voice tight. "Stat. We need to see if the tube migrated." They waited. The storm rattled the windows. Rain began to fall, heavy and deliberate, drumming against the glass like fingers on a coffin lid. Webb's oxygen saturation had stabilized at 83%, and Chen ordered supplemental oxygen, a non-rebreather mask pushed to 10 liters, the kind of high flow that suggested she was already thinking worst-case scenarios. Natalie was preparing to walk Webb to radiology when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway like a shadow given shape. "Nurse Hayes. I need to speak with you. Now." Natalie glanced at the monitor. 83%. She glanced at Webb's face, still lucid, still fighting, but with the look of a man whose body was betraying him. She turned to Chen. Colonel Webb needs continuous monitoring. His saturation is borderline. I've got this, Chen said, and Natalie heard the nervousness underneath, the young doctor's voice that was trying very hard to sound capable. Natalie followed Mercer into the hallway. Through the windows, she could see Tyler, her 16-year-old son, who'd stopped by after dinner to visit the colonel, the man who'd written letters home about Tyler's potential, his leadership, his future. Tyler stood frozen against the far wall, watching the commotion with the kind of adolescent uncertainty that made him look even younger than his years. She wanted to signal him that everything was fine. She wanted to believe it herself. Mercer's office smelled like expensive cologne and stale coffee. He sat at his desk without offering her a chair and began typing emails with theatrical slowness, making her stand while 7 minutes accumulated like dust. The fluorescent overhead light hummed its mechanical drone. Outside, the rain intensified. "Your performance has been unacceptable," he finally said, not looking up. "I'm recommending you for suspension pending a full review. You'll hear from HR tomorrow. The board is taking this seriously, Natalie. Very seriously." Her jaw tightened. She felt the old discipline settle over her like armor, the same composure that had kept her steady when mortars landed 200 meters away, when men screamed with holes in their bodies, when orders came down and you executed them because hesitation killed people. She said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a blade. That's when the alarms began. Not the routine beeps of a disconnected monitor or a low battery. This was the code blue alarm, the shrieking, insistent, unignorable scream that meant someone was dying. Both of them moved simultaneously, Mercer's face flushing with irritation at the interruption, Natalie already moving toward the door because some part of her had been waiting for this moment since she'd checked that chest tube. The hallway erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses converging. A crash cart rolling. And there, Tyler, pressed against the wall, his face the color of old paper. Inside room 407, Colonel Webb had transformed into something barely recognizable. His skin had taken on a gray-blue pallor, the color of a man whose oxygen was failing. His breathing came in desperate, one-sided gasps, his right lung moving while his left side remained eerily still, his chest rising asymmetrically like a broken machine. The chest tube lay on the bed, completely dislodged, a length of useless plastic that had lost contact with the cavity it was meant to drain. Dr. Chen stood frozen beside the bed, her hands trembling visibly, her voice coming out in fractured pieces. His lung, it's collapsed, where's the crash cart? Tension pneumothorax. Margaret Webb, the colonel's wife, had moved to the corner and was making a sound that wasn't quite a scream, not quite a sob, something primal that came from the place where fear lives. The monitor displayed oxygen saturation at 72% and dropping. 68. 64. The numbers fell like stones into dark water. Mercer appeared at Natalie's shoulder in the doorway. What happened? She didn't answer him. Muscle memory took over, the kind of automatic competence that exists in the space between thought and action, the place where training lives permanently. She moved into the room with the certainty of a woman who had done this before, who had done this in dust storms under enemy fire, who had kept men alive on the edge between breathing and drowning. 14-gauge angiocath, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something harder and cleaner than the careful, deferential tone Mercer had been accustomed to hearing. Not a request. A command. A nurse answered immediately, pressing the needle into her hand before she'd finished speaking. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, building pressure, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart. If she didn't release it in the next 90 seconds, Webb's cardiac output would fail. His blood pressure would plummet. His heart would stop because it couldn't pump against the pressure anymore. She found the landmarks on his chest. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The space between his ribs. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had learned this skill in the worst circumstances possible, hand steady as a surgical laser despite everything around her coming apart. She pushed the needle through skin, through muscle, through the pleural membrane. The hiss came immediately, that sound of pressurized air escaping, like a tire deflating, like death stepping back, and Webb gasped, his eyes rolling forward, his breathing suddenly becoming two-sided again, both lungs expanding, the asymmetry correcting itself in real time. The monitor climbed. 74. 81. 88. 92. Get me a catheter over needle, she said. We're converting this to a chest tube. Sterile field. Now. The resident, Chen, moved like someone waking from a dream. A nurse, not the one who'd fled after Mercer's warnings, but Teresa, the surgical tech who'd worked night shift for 8 years, began setting up the tray with hands that knew exactly what would come next. Natalie placed the catheter, secured it with a purse-string suture, connected the drainage system. Webb's oxygen saturation reached 94% and held. His breathing became rhythmic, almost peaceful, the sound of a man whose body had been given a second chance. The resident stammered his thanks. I froze. I knew it was tension pneumothorax, but thank you. God, thank you. Natalie didn't respond. She was already writing in the chart, documenting everything, the time, the displacement, the procedure, the response, her meticulous documentation, the same habit that had drawn Mercer's attention in the first place. Behind her, the room was settling back into something resembling normal. Margaret Webb was crying quietly. Tyler, in the hallway, had the look of someone who'd just witnessed a stranger move like a ghost. And in the doorway, Dr. Mercer stood with his jaw clenched, watching the woman he'd been systematically destroying save a dying man's life with the kind of calm precision that suggested this wasn't her first time doing it. He turned and walked away. What happened next took exactly 54 minutes. Within an hour of that needle puncturing Webb's chest cavity, Mercer made 3 phone calls. The first to Richard Bancroft, the hospital board chairman and his Thursday golf partner, expressing concerns about Natalie Hayes' unorthodox procedures and cavalier attitude toward protocol. The second to Dr. Patricia Summers at the State Nursing Board, planting seeds about falsified credentials and unauthorized medical interventions. The third to Victor Slate, the private investigator he kept on permanent retainer, with a simple instruction: find out who she really is. Whatever she's hiding, I want names, dates, and locations. He didn't know what he was looking for yet. But he knew that Captain Natalie Hayes, who had just performed an emergency needle decompression in his hospital with the casual expertise of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, represented the single greatest threat to his operation. He just didn't know how right he was. The needle went in clean. One motion. The hiss of air escaping like a sigh from Webb's collapsed lung, and his chest expanded for the first time in 3 minutes. 76. 81. 87. The oxygen saturation numbers climbed on the monitor like a prayer being answered. Natalie's hands were rock-steady as she applied the dressing, her fingers moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, which she had, though never with hospital fluorescent lights overhead and an audience frozen in shock. Colonel Webb gasped and his eyes fluttered open. Margaret Webb collapsed into her daughter's arms, shoulders heaving with sobs she'd been holding for 72 hours. Dr. Chen stammered something about freezing, about panic, about how he couldn't move. How thank you, I'm sorry, but Natalie wasn't listening anymore. She'd already moved past him to check the dressing placement, then turned to face the door where Tyler stood in his school uniform, backpack still on, his eyes wide and seeing his mother as something other than the quiet woman who made his lunch in silence every morning. At the far end of the hallway, Dr. Mercer watched from the shadows. His expression didn't change. His hands didn't shake. But his jaw tightened into a knot of white muscle, and in that moment, something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation completing itself. The trembling wasn't visible. It was pure, cold rage, the kind that comes when a threat you've been trying to contain just saved a man's life in front of 3 witnesses and created a liability problem that would not disappear quietly. Within 60 minutes, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to Jim Patterson, the hospital board chairman, his golf partner of 8 years, a man who'd covered for Mercer's conference expenses twice and looked the other way when the quarterly insurance audit seemed to miss certain phantom procedures. Mercer's voice was controlled, even concerned. Jim, that nurse I mentioned, Natalie Hayes, she just performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. A needle decompression. No one called me, no one got consent from the attending, she just did it. I know she saved the patient's life, but that's not the point. The liability exposure here is enormous. What if something goes wrong next time? What if she nicked an artery? We need to protect the hospital. The second call was to the South Carolina State Board of Nursing at 0915 hours. Mercer identified himself by his title and spoke in the measured tone of a concerned colleague reporting irregularities. I'm Dr. Marcus Mercer, Director of Critical Care at St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah. I have concerns about one of our staff nurses, Natalie Hayes. I discovered that her employment application may contain falsified information regarding her prior military service and background. I don't have specifics, but her records seem incomplete. I thought your office would want to investigate her credentials before there's an incident. The third call was to Marcus Holloway, a private investigator who kept a clean office 3 blocks from the courthouse and charged $1,500 a day to find what people had buried. Marcus, it's Mercer. I need everything on a woman named Natalie Hayes. Works night shift at St. Michael's. Probably late 40s, military background, though she might be hiding that. I need her real history. Bank accounts. Addresses. Family. Everything. And I need it by end of business today. Holloway didn't ask questions. Questions lost clients. Today's tight, but I can do a preliminary by 1600 hours. You want me to keep digging after that? Yes, Mercer said. I want to know who she really is. What Mercer didn't know was that Natalie's real identity had been officially erased by the Pentagon's Witness Protection Program. Her military records had been scrubbed from every accessible database. Her prior name, her service dates, her unit assignments, all of it sealed behind classified walls that a private investigator couldn't breach and a hospital administrator couldn't access, no matter how many calls he made or how much money he spent. By 0800 Wednesday morning, however, he had his answer to the employment application question. The HR director called him at home before he arrived at the hospital, her voice carefully neutral. Dr. Mercer, we've reviewed Natalie Hayes' personnel file. You're correct. Her application states no prior military service, but we've found references in her secondary employment history. She listed only civilian positions. This constitutes a material misrepresentation on her application. Mercer smiled into his coffee. This was leverage. This was solid ground. 2 security guards arrived at Natalie's station at 0830. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their uniforms and the cardboard box in one guard's hands made the message clear. The other nurses noticed immediately. Some looked away. Some stared. None of them moved. Ms. Hayes, you need to come with us, the first guard said, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone delivering bad news on a regular Tuesday. Natalie finished documenting her final medication administration, every detail precise, every time stamped accurately, before she stood. She'd expected this. Not the exact mechanism, but the certainty of it. Mercer was too threatened to do anything less. The HR director, Patricia Sums, was a thin woman in her 50s who specialized in the kind of neutrality that protected hospitals from lawsuits. She wouldn't meet Natalie's eyes. Your employment application contained falsified information. Specifically, you failed to disclose prior names and incomplete military service records. This constitutes grounds for immediate termination. Natalie's voice stayed level, not deferential anymore, not soft. I can explain. There's nothing to explain. Clear your locker. You're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The folder Patricia slid across the desk was thin. A check for 2 weeks severance. A document about health insurance continuation. A notice of termination citing falsification of employment application. Every line perfectly legal, perfectly documented, perfectly airtight. Natalie took the cardboard box Patricia offered and walked to the locker room in silence. The other nurses watched from doorways and supply closets. Nobody followed. Nobody spoke. The silence in St. Michael's hallway was the kind that comes after a judgment has been rendered and carried out. Her locker held 7 years of accumulated quiet. She packed the cracked silver coffee mug with Tyler's tiny handprint from 3rd grade. He'd painted it himself, the lettering rough and desperate, "I love you, Mom." She packed the dying succulent she'd kept on her locker shelf for 3 years, its leaves papery and sparse, too stubborn to die completely. She packed the photograph from Kandahar, 10 Marines in desert gear, weapons across their chests, standing in front of a compound wall. Her finger traced one face, then another, then a third. She picked up a pen from her pocket and crossed out the first face with a single, deliberate line. Then another face. Then another. Half of the men in that photograph were still gone, some to roadside bombs, some to time and distance, some to names she'd stopped allowing herself to remember. Security escorted her out through the main lobby at 0930 Wednesday morning. Rain hammered Savannah streets like something desperate trying to get in. She stood at the bus stop 2 blocks away, soaked through, clutching her cardboard box. Water dripped from her hair and ran down her jacket. The photograph of her unit bled ink in the rain, the crossed-out faces smudging into watercolor ghosts. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed even. But something in her chest had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, or after one, or during the moment when you realize you've been erased twice now and the second time was supposed to be safer than the first. That's when Dr. Mercer made his 4th call, not to Patterson, not to the state board, but to a VA database technician at a federal contractor in Arlington. Mercer had met this technician, Derek Chen, at a medical informatics conference 6 months ago. They'd shared drinks and complaints about government inefficiency. Chen had been sympathetic. Chen had been cooperative. Chen had a gambling problem that made him vulnerable to questions about access and discretion. "Derek, I need a favor," Mercer said, his voice carrying the weight of their manufactured friendship. "I have a former employee whose military records seem fraudulent. I want to verify her service history through the VA system. Can you pull her file?" Natalie Hayes. Former Marine. Derek hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. "That's not really appropriate, Dr. Mercer. The VA database is. I know it's sensitive. But she might have committed fraud that affects veteran benefits. The hospital needs confirmation before we pursue legal action. Just pull the file. That's all." What Mercer didn't know was that every single access attempt to classified military personnel records was flagged in real time by an automated federal monitoring system. Every query, every search, every unauthorized access attempt triggered an alert that routed to multiple agencies. The moment Derek Chen's credentials accessed Captain Natalie Reeves's sealed file in the VA database, bells started ringing in Arlington, at the Pentagon, and at the field office of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The investigation had just begun. But Natalie didn't know that yet. She stood at the bus stop in Savannah rain, holding a cardboard box containing the broken pieces of 2 identities, waiting for a bus that would take her back to an apartment that no longer made sense, to tell her son that she'd lost her job, and that she couldn't explain why without explaining everything, and explaining everything meant betraying secrets that weren't hers to tell, secrets that belonged to dead Marines and sealed operations and a government that had asked her to disappear and now, apparently, was willing to let her. The bus stop was 3 blocks away when Tyler's phone buzzed. Then it wouldn't stop. 14 missed calls. 17 text messages. His friend Marcus from the neighborhood had found something in his mom's closet while looking for a sweater he'd left there, a lockbox, rusted, half buried under winter boots. Inside were medals. Heavy medals. Ribbons the color of blood and ocean and desert sand. Tyler read the inscriptions 3 times, his hands shaking in a way his mother's never did, and at 6:07 a.m. he was already at St. Michael's main entrance, backpack rattling like he was carrying something alive. The lobby nurse barely looked up as he passed, just another teenager, no badge, no escort, and by the time Natalie's phone went off for the second time that morning, Tyler was already in the elevator, already pressing 4, already rehearsing the question he'd never expected to need to ask, "Who are you?" Room 407 was dimmer than usual. The morning light hadn't reached the windows yet, and Colonel Webb lay half asleep, the oxygen tubes running soft air into his nostrils, his color finally returning after 3 weeks of the kind of suffering that aged men a decade in a month. His eyes opened when the door clicked. He didn't see Tyler at first. He saw movement. A kid in a hospital hallway at sunrise was unusual enough that his marine instinct still kicked, even medicated, even dying, alert the threat. But Tyler's face registered as safe almost immediately, and the tension drained from Webb's shoulders like someone had cut a valve. "Your mom knows I'm here," Tyler said, which was a lie they both understood was necessary. Webb nodded slowly. Didn't ask for explanation. Instead, Tyler unzipped the backpack. The medals came out one at a time. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts, the ribbon purple as old bruises. And the last one, a Silver Star, but older, the ribbon faded from exposure to sun and sweat and whatever conditions the Kandahar dust imposed on ceremony and protocol. Tyler held up a jacket then. His mother's jacket, the one he'd found in the closet behind the medals. Inside the lining, stitched with careful precision, was a faded unit patch. Desert tan fabric with a symbol that meant nothing to Tyler until he saw Colonel Webb's face change. The old Marine's eyes went wide. The monitors attached to his chest picked up the acceleration, heart rate climbing from 68 to 84 in 3 seconds. His hand moved toward the patch without permission from his brain. "That patch," Webb whispered. His voice was the sound of someone recognizing a ghost. "I wore that patch. Kandahar. 2019." He paused. The machines beeped their anxious rhythm. "Phantom 6. You were Phantom 6. The words hung in the room like dust suspended in light. "My mother," Tyler said carefully, "is Captain Natalie Hayes. Or Reeves. I'm still figuring out which." Webb's eyes closed. When he opened them again, there was something different in his expression, the kind of recognition that only comes when you've seen someone operate in their element and suddenly understand why the earth had been arranged the way it was. "She saved my life. Again." He reached for the phone. "We need to call." The door burst open. Not violently, but with the kind of aggressive urgency that made people instinctively step back. Dr. Mercer. Still in scrubs from an overnight session, his hair disheveled, his eyes carrying the specific red-rimmed intensity of someone who'd spent the last 6 hours sitting in front of a computer screen, and shaking with rage and panic and the dawning realization that his entire constructed world was collapsing. He'd tried to fix it. At 3:36 a.m., unable to sleep, unable to accept that a simple RN could have derailed everything, he'd logged into the VA medical database using his administrative credentials. 23 years of carefully cultivated access. 23 years of being the kind of doctor hospitals trusted with sensitive information. He tried to alter her service dates. Add flags. Make her look fraudulent. Make her disappear the way she'd been supposed to disappear all along. The system had logged every keystroke. Mercer saw the medal spread across Webb's bedsheet. He saw Tyler standing there, still holding the jacket. He saw the patch, faded but unmistakable. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. "What is this?" His voice cracked. "These items shouldn't be. Who authorized?" The door opened again. This time, 2 people came through. A man and a woman, both in dark suits, both carrying the specific kind of posture that meant authority and federal ID and the end of things. Agent Dawson had the kind of face that had spent 20 years in interrogation rooms. Agent Chen carried a laptop like it was evidence of murder. Behind them, stepping into the frame with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, was General Amanda Valdez in dress blues. 2 stars on her shoulder. Eyes like polished steel. She saluted the medals on the bed. "Dr. Richard Mercer?" Agent Dawson's voice was professional. Conversational. The most dangerous tone. You're under arrest for unauthorized access to federal medical databases, falsification of Pentagon records, and 18 months of insurance fraud totaling $1.4 million. He didn't wait for Mercer to respond. Didn't give him the courtesy of shock or denial. You have the right to remain silent. Mercer's hands moved toward the bed as if trying to gather the medals, to take them back, to undo the last 20 minutes and the last 6 months and the entire catastrophic architecture of his own choices. But Agent Chen had already moved, and Mercer found himself surrounded by the kind of authority that couldn't be negotiated with. As they escorted him from the room, Mercer's protests fading down the hallway like the sound of a siren passing, General Valdez pulled out a folder. Not thick, but heavy with the weight of official seals and redacted sections and the official machinery of the Pentagon's acknowledgement that yes, Captain Reeves had been real, that her service had been real, that her medals were real. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, the general said quietly to Tyler, handing him the folder. Your mother is proof of that. 20 minutes later, Natalie stepped out of an Uber in the St. Michael's parking lot. She'd been awake most of the night, staring at the cracked coffee mug her son had made in 3rd grade, wondering how she was going to tell him that she'd been fired from the only job she'd let herself have in 3 years. That the quiet identity, the invisible woman, the night shift nurse, that all of it was over. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving everything wet and gleaming and smelling of river and asphalt and the specific salt-iron scent of Savannah at 6:40 a.m. The lobby was busier now. A nurse she didn't recognize held the door open. Captain Reeves. The woman saluted, informal but genuine. Thank you for your service. Natalie didn't flinch. Didn't show the specific flavor of disorientation that comes when your hidden self suddenly becomes everyone's known reference. She simply nodded and continued toward the elevator, and when the doors opened on the 4th floor, she found her son waiting with medals in his hands and a 2-star general at his shoulder. The interim hospital president offered her the director of nursing position 3 hours later, in a conference room that smelled of fresh coffee and something like professional redemption. The contract was generous. The authority was complete. The respect was unconditional. Natalie signed it at 2:06 p.m. on a Thursday, her signature the same careful script she'd used on every chart she'd ever filed, the same precision that had saved lives and exposed fraud and forced the machinery of federal law to recognize that sometimes the quietest person in the room was carrying the weight of secrets that changed everything. 6 months later, the story was different. Dr. Richard Mercer taught CPR basics at a strip mall community college 3 days a week for $13 an hour. His medical license was suspended pending trial. His career was a cautionary tale whispered in hospital hallways. The nurses who'd abandoned Natalie in the break room under his warnings had watched his perp walk through St. Michael's lobby on the evening news. Carlos couldn't meet her eyes anymore. Denise had transferred to another hospital. The medical supply company owner who'd processed kickbacks was serving 2 years federal time. But Natalie stood at the 4th floor nurses' station at 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, watching the monitors, checking the charts, and the silver coffee mug her son had made in 3rd grade sat on a desk that belonged to her now. The faded unit patch was stitched into the lining of the jacket hanging on the back of her office chair. A new succulent, green and strong and thriving, grew beside the mug. Colonel Marcus Webb had been discharged. He'd written her a letter, which Tyler had delivered personally, written in the careful script of someone who'd spent his life in military precision. Thank you for showing me who Phantom 6 really was. And thank you for showing your son who his mother really is. Both of those things matter more than you know. Tyler shipped to Paris Island in 3 months. He'd enlisted the day after his birthday, 1 week after everything collapsed and reconstructed itself. He wore his mother's unit patch on the inside of his dress uniform jacket too. The hospital's new oversight systems were Natalie's first project as director. Billing audits. Database access logs. A mandatory ethics committee that reported directly to administration. She'd seen what happened when institutions failed to watch themselves. She'd learned that lesson in Kandahar in the desert sun. She was implementing it now under fluorescent lights and the beeping rhythm of machines that kept broken people alive. If you've ever felt invisible at work, ever wondered if anyone would notice if you disappeared, ever needed someone to finally see who you really were, subscribe to the Code Whisperers. We tell the stories they tried to bury. New story drops every Friday. Like and comment below if you've ever been underestimated by someone too blind to see your value. That's what keeps us going.